On the day she was meant to begin her life as queen, her dress became her pyre. The wedding hall should have been filled with laughter, music, and the sweet perfume of roses. Instead, it filled with smoke. At first, it was just a flicker, a spark too small to draw attention, a single ember drifting from a candle, landing upon lace spun so fine it might as well have been kindling. But in the space of a breath, silk became flame. The bride was the first to notice. She gasped as the hem of her gown glowed orange, then crackled into fire. Guests thought it part of some ritual at first, a theatrical display arranged for spectacle. But her scream shattered the illusion. A cry so piercing it cut through the music, silenced the hall, and froze the dancers in place. Then chaos. The gown, a masterpiece of lace, tulle, and embroidered silk, betrayed her in an instant. Each layer, soaked in oils from preparation, caught like dry tinder. The fire raced upward, white veil turning black, jewels glowing red in the heat, roses in her hair shriveling to ash. She became a torch in human shape, a queenly figure engulfed by her own bridal finery. The hall erupted. Nobles staggered back, clutching at their pearls and goblets. Musicians dropped their instruments with clattering discord. Priests shouted prayers, their voices drowned by the roar of fire and the bride's shrieks. Servants scrambled with pitchers of wine, dousing her in desperation, but it only fed the blaze. The groom stood frozen, his face pale, unable or unwilling to move. Some swore she ran, stumbling down the length of the banquet hall, her gown trailing flames across the marble floor. Others insisted she collapsed where she stood, flames clawing up her body until her crown itself glowed. But all accounts agreed on one thing: her screams. Terrible, endless, echoing against the vaulted ceilings long after her body fell silent. By the time the fire was beaten out, nothing remained of her but smoke and charred silk clinging to bone. The feast lay in ruins, the air thick with ash and horror. The hall that should have sung with joy had become a pyre, her wedding gown transformed into a coffin. And in that moment, a celebration meant to bind dynasties ended as a spectacle of dread. A bride burned alive before the eyes of her kingdom became legend. Her death would haunt the palace, the people, and the chronicles that tried in vain to erase her. This is the story of the bride who was burned alive in her wedding dress. Long before the fire consumed her, the bride's fate had already been sealed, not by choice, not by love, but by politics. She was born into a noble house that carried just enough prestige to be useful, and just enough desperation to be pliant. To her family, she was never simply a daughter. She was a contract in human form, a key to unlock royal favour. Her childhood was spent under the weight of expectation. Tutors trained her in courtly grace, priests drilled her in piety, and seamstresses fitted her in gowns meant to display not her personality, but her family's ambition. She learned to curtsy before she learned to run, to silence her thoughts before she was ever asked to speak. Even as a child, she knew her future would not be hers to shape. By the time she reached adolescence, whispers of her beauty spread like wildfire through noble courts. Pale skin, eyes the colour of stormlight, hair that gleamed like polished gold, every detail of her appearance was treated as proof of her destiny. Suitors came and went, each one weighed not for affection, but for what alliances they offered. And when the royal court began its search for a bride for the heir, her name surfaced with terrifying inevitability. The match was not born of passion, it was born of necessity. The kingdom was fractured by rival houses, foreign enemies threatened at its borders, and a union with her family promised to secure loyalty where rebellion festered. For the groom, she was a means to solidify his claim. For her father, she was the bridge to survival. For her, she was a sacrifice dressed in jewels. The negotiations that sealed her fate were merciless. A dowry large enough to drain her family's coffers was promised. Lands and privileges were exchanged like pieces on a chessboard. At no point was she asked what she wanted. Her silence was her consent. Her duty was her prison. When the betrothal was announced, the court erupted in celebration. Priests declared it blessed by God. Nobles hailed it as the beginning of a golden age. Minstrels sang songs of love that had never existed. Peasants whispered among themselves that it was a union of power, not of hearts. And yet, the bride's expression, captured in hastily painted portraits, betrayed something else. A quiet sadness, a heaviness in her eyes, as though she were watching her own funeral procession. Her days leading up to the wedding were filled with rehearsals of rituals she did not believe in. She was paraded before ambassadors, weighed down in jewels, her every movement judged. At night, in the privacy of her chamber, she reportedly whispered prayers not for happiness, but for strength. Her maids would later say she often stared into the mirror for long stretches of silence, as if searching for the girl she'd once been, and finding only a stranger wrapped in silk. To the kingdom, she was a bride destined to be queen, a symbol of unity and prosperity. To herself, she was a torch, waiting for a spark. The marriage was meant to forge peace between families and secure power for generations. But in binding two houses together, it bound her to a fate more terrible than anyone could have imagined. On the day she entered the wedding hall, her gown shimmering with jewels and lace, she was not stepping into a life of love. She was stepping into a trap built of duty, fire and silk. And before the night was done, that very gown, her cage of beauty and politics, would ignite and consume her. The wedding day arrived draped in splendour. From the palace gates to the cathedral doors, garlands of roses hung heavy in the air, their fragrance masking the unease that still lingered from the omens. Bells tolled across the city, and peasants pressed into the streets to watch the gilded carriages roll past, hoping for a glimpse of the young bride whose name had already become legend. Inside the cathedral, the ceremony unfolded with rehearsed precision. The groom stood tall, armoured not for war but for pageantry, his breastplate polished until it reflected the stained glass light like fire. The bride, veiled in white silk embroidered with gold thread, moved down the aisle with a grace that belied the tremor in her steps. The choir sang, priests lifted their hands in blessing, and courtiers whispered in awe of the jewels glittering in her crown. To the kingdom, it was the very image of divine union. To her, it was the tightening of chains. When the vows were spoken, her voice trembled only slightly, lost beneath the choir's thunderous hymns. Rings were exchanged, prayers recited, and as the ceremony ended, the crowd erupted in cheers. The union was sealed. But behind the bride's faint smile, her eyes betrayed something else, a shadow of resignation, as if she already knew the cost of this alliance. From the cathedral, the procession wound back to the palace, where the great hall awaited. The banquet tables groaned under the weight of roasted boars, gilded pheasants, sugared fruits, and towers of cakes shaped like castles. Jugs of wine poured endlessly, filling golden goblets until the air itself seemed soaked in sweetness and intoxication. Musicians struck their lutes and viols, dancers spun across the polished marble floor, and courtiers raised endless toasts to the health of the new couple. At the centre of it all sat the bride and groom, elevated on a dais like monarchs presiding over the world. The groom, flushed with pride and wine, laughed easily, boasting of alliances secured, heirs promised, and rivals silenced. The bride sat beside him, her gown shimmering in candlelight, her jewels catching every flicker of flame. To the court she was radiant. To those closest to her, she seemed unnaturally still, her smile strained, her eyes glassy as if looking somewhere far away. Throughout the feast, subtle moments betrayed the undercurrent of dread. A goblet slipped from her hand, shattering against the floor. When the musicians struck a triumphant note, she flinched as though startled by thunder. One servant swore her hands trembled each time a candle was set near her gown, though the detail was quickly dismissed as gossip. Still the grandeur pressed on, toasts were shouted, songs sung, speeches made of eternal prosperity. Priests declared the union blessed, poets recited verses comparing her beauty to flames, a cruel irony unnoticed by most in that moment. Every gesture, every word was designed to reinforce the image of perfection. But perfection has cracks, and in this hall of gold and glory unease seeped quietly through them. Some courtiers whispered that the bride's pallor was unnatural, that her voice when she spoke sounded hollow, like a prayer recited without faith. A few noticed the way her gaze lingered on the great candelabras, flames reflected in her eyes with something closer to fear than fascination. By midnight the feast had reached its peak. Wine had loosened tongues, laughter echoed against the rafters, and the music soared. The groom rose for one final toast, his goblet raised high, his words drowned in cheers. And as the court roared its approval, none realized that the hall itself was already preparing to host not a celebration but a catastrophe. The bride sat motionless, the lace of her gown brushing the floor, her veil trembling in the candlelit air. She had smiled for the last time. The feast was nearly over, but her story was only beginning. It began with the smallest of sparks, so small that no one noticed at first. A single candle, toppled by an elbow during a toast, sent a bead of flame onto the embroidered hem of the bride's gown. For a breath, the silk smouldered quietly, curling like parchment in the heat. Then, with terrifying speed, it erupted. The hall fell silent for half a heartbeat before her scream split the air. It was not the polite gasp of a startled bride, but a raw, piercing cry that froze every soul in place. The music collapsed into silence. Dancers staggered mid-step, goblets hung suspended in mid-air. The feast, moments ago a symphony of laughter and wine, transformed into a theatre of horror. Her gown, woven of lace, tulle, and gilded silk, was the perfect fuel. Each layer ignited as though soaked in oil, flames racing upward in jagged tongues. The roses pinned into her veil shriveled into black cinders, the jewels at her throat glowing red-hot against her skin. Within moments she was not a bride, but a blazing effigy, a living torch at the heart of the celebration. The court erupted into chaos. Guests stumbled back from the table, shrieking as the flames leapt higher. Some tried to rush forward, only to recoil in terror at the heat. Others shouted for water, for blankets, for mercy. Servants ran with pitchers of wine and jugs of ale, dousing her in desperation, but the liquid only hissed, feeding the blaze. The groom stood frozen beside her, his face drained of blood, goblets slipping from his hand. Witnesses later argued whether he tried to help or simply stared, paralyzed by fear. The king rose to his feet, roaring orders no one could follow. Priests clutched relics and screamed prayers to the heavens, their words swallowed by the roar of fire. The bride staggered from her chair, her body engulfed. Some swore she ran down the hall, trailing flames like a comet across the marble floor. Others claimed she collapsed immediately, writhing as the fire consumed her. But all agreed on the sound, the screams that echoed against the vaulted ceiling, high and terrible, until her voice broke into silence. By the time guards smothered the last of the flames with heavy tapestries, it was too late. The hall was choked with smoke, the stench of burning silk and flesh clinging to every stone. Where once had sat a bride in splendour now lay only a charred figure, her gown fused to her body, her crown twisted into blackened metal. The feast was over. What was meant to be the dawn of a dynasty had become a funeral pyre lit before the eyes of the kingdom. Nobles wept or fainted, servants collapsed in shock, and foreign envoys whispered of curses and assassinations. The music had ended. The joy had ended. And the marriage, sealed hours earlier, was already ashes. In that moment, the court realized that silk and lace had betrayed them. What was meant to glorify had destroyed. The bride's beauty had become her death, her gown her executioner. And as the smoke curled toward the rafters, some swore they saw her veil still burning, drifting like a ghost through the air before vanishing into shadow. The fire had begun with a spark, but its echoes would burn through history for centuries. Panic gripped the palace like a vice. The great hall, once alive with music and feasting, became a storm of shrieks, prayers, and chaos. Smoke drifted upward in black clouds, curling against the gilded ceiling, while the scent of charred silk and scorched flesh clung to every breath. Nobles stumbled over overturned goblets and broken platters, their jewelled finery stained with ash and spilled wine. Servants scattered in all directions, some rushing to obey shouted orders, others fleeing as if the fire itself were chasing them. At the dais, the groom stood paralyzed. His bride's crown, twisted and blackened by heat, still smoked at his feet. Witnesses swore his face was as pale as marble, his lips trembling as though he were caught between rage and despair. Some claimed he whispered her name, others insisted he muttered curses at the heavens, but what all agreed upon was his refusal to move, even as guards dragged the body away. The king, meanwhile, was consumed by fury. His roar echoed across the chamber, demanding answers, demanding someone to blame. He called for the captain of the guard, for the priests, for anyone who could explain how such a catastrophe could unfold in the very heart of his palace. His rage was so great that courtiers flinched simply to look at him. To the king, this was more than tragedy. It was humiliation, a spectacle of weakness displayed before his own allies and rivals. The priests attempted to seize control, but their words only fanned the fire of fear. Some cried that it was divine punishment, that the bride carried secret sins which had invited God's wrath. Others insisted it was witchcraft, pointing trembling fingers at foreign envoys seated among the guests. Their chants rose louder and louder, until the hall seemed to echo not with hymns, but with hysteria. Rumours ignited faster than the flames had. One courtier whispered that the groom's enemies had hidden oil within the gown, turning silk into tinder. Another swore he saw a shadow slip from the hall moments before the fire began. A servant claimed the bride had been cursed from birth, her family line marked for destruction. With each rumour came fresh terror, fresh suspicion, fresh cries for vengeance. The guests themselves became divided. Some clutched their rosaries and begged for mercy, refusing to believe it was anything but the will of heaven. Others demanded the guards search the palace immediately, certain that assassins lurked in the shadows. A few fled entirely, slipping into the night to carry tales of horror to every corner of the kingdom. Through it all, the queen, the bride's mother, was inconsolable. Witnesses described her as collapsing to the ground, her wails piercing even the din of chaos. She clawed at her gown, begging to be taken to her daughter's remains, but soldiers held her back. Her grief became its own accusation, against the court, against the king, against the silence that swallowed every answer. As hours passed, the chaos only deepened. Guards dragged suspected servants into corners for questioning, their cries echoing through the smoke-filled hall. The envoys, insulted and terrified, threatened retaliation if accused unjustly. Nobles huddled together in fearful groups, whispering of omens ignored and curses fulfilled. No one dared leave, for the palace gates had been locked under the king's command. The celebration had become a prison of fear. By dawn, the great hall lay in ruins. The banquet tables stood overturned, the marble floor stained with soot and ash. The air reeked of smoke and dread. And though the fire had been extinguished, its legacy lingered in every whisper, every trembling glance. The court had gathered to witness a marriage. Instead, they had borne witness to a spectacle of death. And in the absence of truth, suspicion became the only language spoken. The bride was gone, but the chaos she left behind threatened to consume them all. By morning, the palace was suffocating beneath the weight of scandal. The smoke had cleared from the great hall, but the stench of shame lingered. What had been meant as the crowning glory of the dynasty had become a spectacle of horror whispered across the kingdom. The king knew at once that the truth could not be allowed to stand. If the people believed their bride had burned like a heretic in God's own house, whispers of curses and divine wrath would follow. The dynasty itself could unravel. And so, the work of erasure began. The first order was silence. Servants were commanded under threat of death never to repeat what they had seen. Some were bribed with gold, others cowed by soldiers' blades. Those who wept too loudly or spoke too freely disappeared into the dungeons, their voices extinguished as ruthlessly as the flames that had consumed the bride. Even among the nobles, silence was demanded. Courtiers who dared describe the truth were accused of treason, their estates seized, their names blackened. Within days, fear became the court's strongest chain. Next came the story itself, rewritten by royal decree. Heralds proclaimed that the bride had fallen ill during the feast, struck down by sudden fever. Priests preached from pulpits that she had been taken swiftly to heaven, her soul too pure to remain among mortals. In chronicles hastily compiled, her death was framed not as horror but as providence, an angel reclaimed by God on the very night of her union. The body was dealt with swiftly, almost brutally. Her remains, charred beyond recognition, were hidden beneath layers of lace and jewels to mask the truth. The gown, blackened and stiff with soot, was stripped from her and burned in secret, its ashes scattered into the river at night. What should have been preserved as relics of memory were obliterated, as though fabric itself might whisper the truth if allowed to remain. Her funeral was rushed and hushed. No grand procession, no tolling bells, no public mourning. At dawn, under a sky still bruised from smoke, she was carried into the royal crypt. Priests mumbled prayers in low voices, while guards stood watch with drawn swords. The queen, shattered by grief, begged for more time, more ritual, more dignity for her daughter. The king silenced her with a glare, declaring that too much mourning would only feed gossip, and so the coffin was sealed, the stone rolled into place, and the bride was buried not only in earth, but in silence. Her portraits were removed from the palace walls. Her name, once sung in celebratory verse, was written in chronicles only in passing. The bride who died before her reign began. Court painters who had captured her likeness were ordered to destroy their canvases. In official records, she became a footnote, a shadow, a tragedy too dangerous to name. And yet, the effort to erase her only made the whispers louder. Among the servants, stories multiplied. They spoke of her veil still glowing faintly with embers, folded away in some hidden chest. They swore that on the night of her burial smoke seeped through the stones of the crypt, carrying with it the faint scent of roses and char. Among the peasants, the tale grew darker still. They said her spirit had not been buried with her body, that she had risen from the flames to walk the halls in silence, her gown still smouldering. The cover-up may have secured the throne for a time, but it did nothing to erase the terror that hung over the court. Every flickering candle became a threat. Every banquet felt like a funeral waiting to happen. The bride was gone, but her presence remained, more powerful in death than she had ever been in life. History tried to forget her, legend refused, and in the end it was not the crown's version of her story that endured, but the whispered memory of the bride who burned alive in her wedding dress. Erisha may have silenced the court, but it could not silence the people. In taverns, marketplaces, and peasant cottages, the story of the burning bride spread like wildfire, and with each retelling, her death grew less like a tragedy of silk and accident, and more like a haunting that refused to be buried. Servants whispered that the royal chamber where her body had been prepared reeked of smoke long after it had been scrubbed. Maids claimed to wake in the night choking on invisible fumes, their eyes stinging as though they stood again in the banquet hall. Guards patrolling the crypt swore they heard the crackle of flames behind stone walls, though no torch was near. A few claimed they saw light flickering within the sealed coffin itself, as if fire still burned where flesh had turned to ash. Soon sightings spread. A chamberlain confessed he had seen her veil drifting down an empty corridor, glowing faintly as though lit by embers. Another servant claimed to encounter her in the palace chapel, kneeling at the altar, her gown in tatters, smoke rising from her charred train, before vanishing in a gust of cold air. Priests tried to dismiss these stories as tricks of grief, but when even their own brothers confessed to seeing her shadow in candle flames, the church itself began to tremble. Among the common people, the legend took deeper root. Ballads were sung of the bride in flames, versus painting her as a victim of royal cruelty or divine wrath. Children were warned never to play with fire, lest the burning bride visit them in the night. Newlyweds whispered prayers to her ghost, begging that their own unions not end in smoke and screams. She ceased to be simply a princess. She became an omen, a figure who walked between memory and curse. The most chilling tales came from the great hall itself. Guests invited to banquets in later years described sudden draughts that extinguished candles without warning, leaving the room in eerie darkness. Others swore the tapestries still smelled of ash whenever music was played. Once, during a feast, a noblewoman shrieked when the hem of her gown caught fire, not from a candle, but from nothing at all. The flame vanished instantly, leaving no scorch marks, but the panic it caused nearly ended the evening. To many, it was proof. The burning bride had returned to remind them of the night she was betrayed. Foreign envoys carried the tale abroad, and in distant courts the story grew more grotesque. Some said her ghost was seen walking the battlements, her gown trailing sparks across the stone. Others claimed she appeared in the mirrors of visiting nobles, her face half burned, eyes weeping smoke. The farther the tale travelled, the darker it became, Yet, at its heart, it always returned to the same image, a bride consumed by fire on the night meant to secure her destiny. Historians, centuries later, tried to strip the story back to fact. They wrote of a careless candle, a panicked crowd, a preventable accident. But their cold accounts could never erase what legend had made of her. To the people, she was not a victim of circumstance. She was a warning carved in flame that power devours innocence, that beauty can become a prison, and that the lies of kings cannot bury truth forever. And so her story endured, retold at hearthsides and in hushed corridors, long after her name was scratched from chronicles. The bride was gone, but her fire remained. It flickered in memory, it burned in song, it haunted stone walls. She was no longer flesh and blood. She was eternal flame, a ghost whose veil still smouldered in the shadows of the palace.